John Pahl of Allegan, Michigan. The interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Now, Mr. Pahl, can you start by telling us a little bit about your background? To start with, where and when were you born?
Well, I was born in Fennville, and our family lived there for 10 years and then moved to Allegan just in time for the Big Depression.
Now, what did your family do for a living?
My father was a rural mail carrier. That's why we were in Fennville. But he had been gassed in World War I, and his health gave out in 1930, so we moved to Allegan, where he was going to get other employment, or trying to. We lived here and have lived here in Allegan for the rest of my life, which is now 90 years.
Okay. Now, what kind of education did you have?
It would be the equivalent of 2 years of college. We could teach in rural schools with a special county limited certificate for 2 years, which counted as 1 year of college. And then we'd have to get it renewed and keep until we finally got a degree.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, were you teaching when the war started?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, the war actually started in 1939,
mm-hmm.
and I was teaching at that time, just started. I taught 4 years before the war.
Or before you got in the war?
Before I got into it.
Okay. Now, as a teacher, were you paying attention to what was happening in the world in 39 and in 1940, the war in Europe and that kind of thing?
Oh yes, a teacher in a rural school teaches everything. History, geography, English, everything.
Mm-hmm.
And we had our map, black or bulletin board, and we would review the progress of the war as part of our schoolwork. It was a good way to teach the kids how to spell names of all these foreign places. Great way to teach geography.
All right. Now, were you expecting before Pearl Harbor that we were going to get involved? Did you think that President Roosevelt would get us into the war, or did you not know?
Well, I wasn't enthusiastic about it, but I knew very well that sooner or later I was going to get involved because, well, I took a look at my face in the bathroom mirror when I was shaving, and I said, you can't let other people fight your battles for you. So I was not disappointed when I got drafted.
All right. And then when were you drafted?
I was, I was immediately registered for the draft as soon as war was declared because I was 21 at the time, and in October of 42, why I was declared 1A, and in order to report for duty January 13th, 43.
Okay. Now, where did you report to?
We reported, well, from Allegan we went to Kalamazoo, and we went to the center at Camp Grant at Rockford, Illinois, where the draftees were sorted and screened and checked for shots and all the other good things that you get. I think I got a series of shots 7 times. I must be immune to everything. But anyway, they decided at Camp Grant where we were going to go. And it was decided, they always put you where you're best suited, that I should take infantry basic and quartermaster schooling at Fort Warren at Cheyenne, Wyoming. which is where the wind blows all the while. And I can remember walking guard duty out there at 28 degrees below zero. It was in the winter. I think Wyoming is always cold.
Right. Now, how long was the basic training? How many weeks?
Basic training was 3 months. And we were trained with, basically with World War I equipment, because World War II equipment was being rushed to England and our main ally, England. So we were training with World War I rifles and various equipment. They all shoot pretty well.
Right. Now, did you have at least World War II uniforms, or did you have leggings?
No, we got proper uniforms.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I got to be a sharpshooter, by the way, of which I'm very proud.
Now, did you have experience with guns from before? Had you done any hunting, or was this all new to you?
Not really. No, I basically was a fisherman.
Mm-hmm.
But I did go once in a while with my father, maybe on hunting, but not with rifles. We just had shotguns.
All right. Now, you also mentioned before, what was the canteen they gave you? You had a World War I rifle, and what about the canteen?
The canteen I got was had a name scratched on the bottom of it. It was aluminum, and it had a man's name on there and his address from Sault Ste. Marie, and it was the date on it was 1917. But it held water.
Right.
That was all it was supposed to do.
Okay. Now, part of what they do in basic training is they teach you military discipline, and they give you a lot of physical training. Did you handle all of that well? Was it relatively easy to learn to be a soldier?
Yes. Infantry basic is tough. It's tougher than ordinary basic. They wanted us to be good and strong, which was easy to do in the winters where they're all way below freezing. You got strong in a hurry. Oh yes. We had calisthenics and practice close order drill and open order drill and practice marches and all sorts of maneuvers. Yes, we got a good thorough basic, and I was very glad I got it. Came in handy later.
Okay. Now, did you also have to learn military discipline?
Oh, absolutely. We even got to learn that we had to salute the general's horse. And not just the general, but his horse, if the horse was free.
All right. Now, so you spent your 3 months in Wyoming.
Yes.
And then where did they send you for the quartermaster training?
Well, I was accepted for the quartermaster officers training school at Camp Lee, Virginia. Fort Lee, it is now still there, at Petersburg, Virginia. And that was a rigorous training course, but thank goodness the infantry basic stood us in good standing, although the quartermasters never had to be as hardy as the infantry.
Now, what did they actually teach you in quartermaster training?
How all the records, you see, the quartermasters are the record keepers for the Army, and they keep all the records of supplies, where they go, how you get them, how you distribute them, the railroad lines that handle them, how you maneuver truck convoys, the movement of supplies, and of course the records that you must keep, and the records that you have to keep for the troops, their basic records, their service records and such, and how to even run a military cemetery or a delousing station, or even how to run a mess hall. I learned how to do that as well too. All these different things. That came in handy.
Now, did you complete the quartermaster officer training?
Yes. The very last day before graduation, we were all set, ready to graduate the next day, July 28th of 43. A representative from the War Department came down and said that he had a special opportunity that we could volunteer for, and we could be given a direct commission in the Air Force instead of quartermaster. Well, that sounded rather tempting, because I noticed at the social activities we attended, the girls all liked that wings on your uniform much better than the quartermaster cartwheel. So it sounded rather interesting, but I still didn't know what they wanted. But it was a volunteer deal. But you had to be either in civil life a teacher or a lawyer or a stockbroker, because you had to be able to do mental arithmetic quickly and accurately.
Mm-hmm. All right. So that was all you knew at that point?
That was explained to us at this secret meeting. It was so secret that if you talked in your sleep, you couldn't go to the meeting, even if you were qualified.
All right. Now, did they have that secret meeting that day when the men from the War Department came?
The day before graduation.
Okay.
Yes. And it was strictly volunteer. I thought about it and decided I think I would go down to the orderly room that day later and volunteer. And I noticed on the bulletin board outside the officers' room the names of the officers that would be volunteering to be commissioned in the Air Corps. And my name was there, and I hadn't even volunteered yet. But the Army does things fast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The next day we graduated with the class, of course, and we immediately were commissioned in the Air Corps and ordered to the radar school at Orlando, Florida.
All right. Now, by the way, as you were going to these different places where you were training, how did they get you there?
By rail.
Okay.
We went on railroads everywhere. That was one good thing I learned in the quartermaster. All these different rail lines and which ones have the best fares and so on, because of agreements way back, some of them dating back to the Civil War, that the Army had made with the railroad companies. And so those were good things to know.
All right. So now that they send you down to Florida, can you describe what that base was like where you were doing your radar training?
Well, there again, we had British instructors been sent over from England to teach us how to be controllers and use radar. Up until that time, we had just a very few little isolated radar stations like Boston, New York, major cities. That was all the radar that we had. Radar was a basic British invention, and they were not too cozy about wanting us to have it. But they finally decided that they needed a great many more radar controllers than they had, so we went down there and we were studying the capabilities of radars. And we also had to study the capabilities of the aircraft, of all of our aircraft, the Allied aircraft, and their possibilities, and the Axis aircraft. Yes, we had to know their capabilities too, and we'll get to that later. But anyway, that was part of our training. And of course, we, while we were training, we actually had some airplanes we could maneuver around. We had actual planes stationed at the Orlando airport. The pilots from those planes were fellows that had been involved in the Battle of Britain, and so they were airmen who knew their business, and they were not very gracious to us student radar operators, but we could maneuver them around, get used to giving orders and seeing them executed and so on. We had one very interesting incident when I got to talk to the president by accident. These airplanes that we had were not just loaned to us, but they also had to get airtime. So they were going out over the Gulf of Mexico, and there was a bomber range laid out there, and they'd have little test bombs, one, two on each plane, and they'd go out there and they would drop those marker bombs, they called them, to decide, how accurate their bombing was being done. Well, Florida has a deadly fog at 4 in the afternoon. It gets as regular as clockwork. They were all supposed to be done out there with their test bombing by 4 o'clock. And of course they couldn't come back and land with those fused bombs on their wings. But one guy was late getting out there, and he had not dropped his bombs in the bombing range. The fog came in and it was so thick I don't think they could see the propeller in front of the plane. But anyway, he hadn't dropped his bombs, and it was time for him to come back. And we knew where he was because we had the radio or the radar we were working with at Orlando. We knew precisely where he was. And he was coming back to the shore of Florida. And so we advised him. We didn't, our instructor did. He took this over personally. And he was trying to talk him into going back out into the Gulf to unload his bombs. And this fellow told him where to go and how to get there. And he was flying the plane, and he would do as he jolly well pleased. He knew where he was. And so what he succeeded in doing was dropping his 2 marker bombs on the public square in Dunedin, Florida. One of them made a crater in the public square, and the other bomb hit a house that was fronting on the square. Belonged to a little old gentleman who always went out to his front porch at 4 in the afternoon to read the evening paper. But that particular afternoon, he happened to have a call to go inside the house for some reason. So he got up and went inside just as the bomb sheared the porch right off his house. Best call he ever got. And immediately the phone in the control room started ringing. We had a phone line there from the White House. And the president wanted to know because they assumed that a German sub, they had figured, Germany couldn't have shelled us or bombed us because there was no way they could. Must have been a sub out there in the fog just for fun, exercising their deck gun. Now, if they had studied those shell fragments, they would have known they were bombed. But they were convinced that a sub had fired on the United States. I later learned, several years later, at a TV broadcast, that the only overt action that the Nazis took against the United States were the 2 shells that a submarine fired in Florida. Well, the question they asked was, have you any record of this sub? Any records at all? what's going on out there? And the Coast Guard was calling, and the Navy Department was calling, and everything you could think of was calling, trying to figure out where this sub was. Well, we told the truth. We said we have no records of a sub in the Gulf, and our radar wouldn't pick it up if it was, very likely at that distance.
Right.
And so we didn't volunteer any further information, but I imagine that pilot would have been hung by the thumbs if we had told the true story. But anyway, that is one little incident in our radar training that we learned that you can be, you better be pretty darn careful with where you're gonna dump things.
Right. Now, how long did you spend in the radar school?
In the radar school, 3 months.
Okay.
We graduated down there in September. And immediately were ordered to various radar centers that were being set up all around the east and west coastline for a month for OJT training with some known controllers that were already operating. I was sent to Mitchell Field, which meant that I was stationed in the radar center on Manhattan Island for a month. Very interesting. If I had been there more than a month, I'd be in bankruptcy yet. But anyway, everything you did there, we called it the land of palms, because everybody that did anything for you had his palm stuck out and expected a generous tip. But anyway, we learned actual training there, and we could, from New York, we could spot subs at sea at night off the harbor, way out off New York Harbor, because convoys would be making up and they'd come out at night. And that was a happy hunting ground. They were having ships getting torpedoed off the New Jersey coast practically one a night. But if a sub had, well, it had to come up at night to recharge its batteries. And so the radar can pick up anything metallic, even an oil drum floating on the water could be picked up. Well, we could tell from the blip on the radar tube what we had, and we could distinguish what looks like a sub and what is just a piece of jetsam or flotsam, whatever. So we would call the Coast Guard down on Long Island and tell them, give them the grid, and tell them that we had spotted a target. We didn't know what it was. I think some of them were whales. But anyway, in about an hour we'd get a call back, Coast Guard. We dumped a few ash cans on your target. I think we took care of it. So we were learning, and we were there a month.
Okay. Now, so I take it you got some time off. You got some liberty while you were in New York.
From that, well, when we went from base to base, we had a week of a leave time we could go home. But when we left New York, we got our week of leave time, and then we reported to, they started making up units then. And we were ordered to go to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, which was interesting because you could be sent, your unit go either east or west. From there, that was an old school and it had a lot of room for units to be organized and so forth. So that's when our group of men first got together that later wound up, most of them anyway, where we were going. We still had no idea where we were going, nor when. We just were out there getting ready. Jefferson Barracks was good duty, actually. We had training marches, we had things to keep us occupied. A lot of activities going on in St. Louis that were, they were extremely hospitable to servicemen, and I discovered that I'd get a weekend pass from St. Louis, and if I left early on Friday evening, I could be in Kalamazoo Saturday morning, and I wouldn't have to go back until Saturday evening. And one of my buddies would sign me in by midnight Sunday, and so I had a weekend home.
All right. Okay. Now, how long did you stay in St. Louis?
Well, let me see. We got there in the middle of October, and we were there for Thanksgiving, and well, let me look on this one, it's easier. This is what I'm looking for. We actually got our shipping orders December 29th to Camp Patrick Henry, Newport News, Virginia. So we figured we were going somewhere east. They had tried to screen us there because the radars were given special treatment in a way. They outlined all the theaters where we were needed, desperately needed, and quickly needed. But if we could list the one we'd prefer to go to, and if they could arrange it, you know, first come, first served, why they would do it. Well, I knew I didn't want to go to North Africa because that theater was still active, but it was, I don't like deserts and so on. And I knew I wouldn't have a chance to get to England because everybody wanted to go to England. And I didn't want to go to the Southeast Asia one because I don't like jungles. So we never heard of India at that time, or the 10th Air Force. That wasn't organized yet. I put down Iceland because we did have a radar station there. Nobody wanted to go there. It was cold. But we had one there that we would fly aerial cover for the convoys going to Europe. And we could spot enemy ships and subs. You can spot a sub in the water in the daytime if, you know, you can see a shadow. Well, I had a friend in headquarters, and he assured me that the code message came in assigning all you fellows for your destinations. And I can't read the code, it's in code, but I know the first letter. Now where you're going begins with I, so I think you're safe to go to Iceland, your unit. Now all you guys run down quick-like and get some wool uniforms and long john underwear and be ready because you may not be able to get those supplies in Iceland. So we all did that. We didn't know for sure where we were going. We never did know until we got there. But we were at Camp Patrick Henry, and we got there January the 1st, 44. We were there for 10 days getting our overseas shots, getting our records and papers in order and things that had to be done, and waiting for the ship.
Okay. Now, what kind of ship did you sail on?
Oh, this was a honey. We got a big liner, the Empress of Scotland, that had been made into a troop ship. I was stationed in a little room that had been a card room on this ship with 32 other officers. The bunks were 6 high, and the fellow in the top bunk always wanted to save a little time in the morning washing up, because with that crowd of guys washing in the morning, he'd take his helmet and fill it with water. Now if the ocean was a little rough and that water would slop, we 5 guys down below would get christened. Well, we fixed him later, but anyway, it was a good ship and a fast ship. Now, because it was a fast ship, we sailed without a convoy. We could outrun any sub, provided we saw it before it saw us. Well, we were on the ship, we shoved off January 11th, and we went out to sea. Well, now, we expected the ship to zigzag, of course. It's only sensible. Well, now, I'm quite adept at reading maps. We learned that in our radar training, and I'd also been very good in geography in my teacher training. And we'd go north sometime, we'd go north, but I kept a little notebook, and I was estimating. We didn't know the distances, we didn't know our destination. I had to estimate distance, speed, and all that, which I managed to do. And I kept in a day-by-day account. We never sighted land after we left Virginia, never. But I figured out fairly soon that we were making more zigs south than we were making zags north. So I assumed we were going south. So I had in my luggage this little atlas book, and I'd chart along the coast here where I thought we were. Now we were told actually that when we had passed by Cuba, we didn't see it, but we could see a big smudge way over on the skyline. But we couldn't tell whether it was land or clouds, but we figured that that had to be Cuba. And that's the only thing we sighted until we got down in the South Atlantic. Now this ship had deck guns on it that were manned by British gunners from the Battle of Britain. They knew how to handle a gun. Incidentally, I knew how to handle a gun too. That was part of my basic training.
Mm-hmm.
I was qualified to fire everything up to and including a 75 millimeter cannon,
Mm-hmm.
which turned out to be too light for use. And we got nothing smaller than 90s when we got there. Anyway, they decided they would have gunnery practice. And they told us we were passing the island of Elba. We didn't actually see it,
Mm-hmm.
but island of Elba was over there in the distance where Napoleon had spent his last days.
Well, there was, you mean St. Helena?
South Atlantic.
That's St. Helena.
Mm-hmm.
Elba is next to Italy.
St. Helena, yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
you're correct. I'm corrected there. But anyway, we knew when we crossed the equator too. King Neptune came on. We crossed the equator, and King Neptune came on January 19th, and we were all inducted into the Seamen's Union, and but the gunnery practice took place on the 23rd of January. They dumped some oil drums, empty oil drums in the sea, let them get about a mile away. And our ship had deck guns, and they also had rocket racks for use against aircraft and so on. So, but we had never even seen another ship in all this time. Well, our boys at the deck guns got direct hits with the first shot on those drums. They knew exactly how to level those guns and how to fire them. It was very comforting to know. Now that same day, January the 26th, we still hadn't sighted land, but we did get down to the point where we were ready to make a landing, and we were quite concerned. We sighted a submarine periscope, but it was off just more or less to the rear of our ship. We don't know what the sub was, never surfaced, but the periscope kind of followed along. We could tell because it cut across the white caps, and all the wave white caps went the other way. We immediately, I was on sub watch that day, I called the bridge. The captain put his foot down on the gas, and that ship just shuddered with the speed. He full speed ahead. But so we never got to say we saw anything more of the sub. Either the sub, if it was a German, and it probably was, because this area down there, which happened to be off Cape Town, South Africa, was a happy hunting ground for subs, because all the stuff going to India and that part of the Middle East, even for part of the North Africa theater, the Egyptian part, had to go down around Cape Town and up. So it was a good place for subs to interrupt shipping. Well, he might have been out of torpedoes, which is possible. They had no way to replenish them. And he might have decided that he didn't want to get in a naval gun battle with our ship. But anyway, we made land Cape Town, and we had a 3-day layover. Most beautiful city I've ever seen in my life. I liked it. The people there were very good to service people. Threw a big party for all of us officers, and the only time in my life they had arranged a party at the country club for all of the officers on the ship, and of course I'm an officer. We went, and they had arranged with the young ladies in Cape Town, so we all had dates, and my date was an Irish lady poet, a very, very charming lady, and we were dancing, and they were dancing. They were trying to play American pop music, and they did fairly well, but they finally hit a polka. It was the beer barrel polka. Now, I had never danced a polka in my life. I could do some fast dances, but I had never done a polka. My date said, "You want to try it?" I said, "Let's go." So we started, and I followed her. She knew how to polka, and we gave an exhibition. Somebody hollered, "Clear the floor and let 'em roll." That's the first and only time I ever really danced a polka, up until I finally had a daughter that married a Polish boy, and then I had to know more about the polka.
Right.
Well, anyway, we were there 3 days to take oil and water, and we started. Well, by this time we pretty well figured out that we were not going to Iceland for certain. And we had it pretty well figured when Neptune came on. But we were going up the Indian Ocean, and we didn't know where we were going, whether we were going up to join the British forces in Egypt, or where we were going. Nobody had ever heard of any other place to go. It was active, but we didn't see any land anywhere. Never even sighted Madagascar. They didn't want us to come near land on account of possible subs. But we kept going up and up and up. And we finally, February the 8th, we discovered where we were going. We landed in Bombay, India. And we got our orders for Bombay, finally. Our radar orders. And we were ordered to the air defense wing, all of us controllers. And this ship was carrying several hundred men. We had on our ship, going overseas, we had all the chaplains for the China, Burma, India theater on that one boat. Oh, we were spiritually protected, and we were. But anyway, but we had hundreds of other fellows that were assigned to different branches of what would be the 10th Air Force. The 10th Air Force had just been ordered formed in India. Yes, it was actually formed, well, back in the later part of 42 with the remnants of the forces that had been kicked out of Burma. They had a few planes, they had some ground troops, but just rags and tags. It was nothing but a skeletal organization. Well, we had enough stuff to flush it out. Now, we didn't have pilots or anything, but they had to come later. They did have some pilots that had managed to escape. Well, anyway, we were ordered into a camp at Bombay, Camp Worley, which was a British camp. And then we discovered that India and Burma and China, nominally, were a British theater, and it would be under a British High Commander, Lord Mountbatten. Well, I'll tell you about him later. But anyway, they were holding their breath and hoping that the Japanese wouldn't get sufficient strength to penetrate that mountain chain between them and Burma. And which they could. There were paths. That's how Stilwell and the ground forces that escaped had gotten back to India, just over walking out over the mountain paths. But anyway, we were at Camp Worley, and we stayed there for a month, just cooling our heels. What we didn't know was that they weren't ready for us up where we were going. We finally got orders to report to the Air Defense Wing at Calcutta, which was organizing there. And we went by rail, first class rail. That was an interesting ride. Their railroad situation in India was top hole. Their railroads were the best run of any I've ever seen, on time and run correctly and so on. We did snafu them a little bit. We had a long train, and of course we had mess kits, and of course we had a carload of rations on the train. It took us from February 26th to March 2nd to go across India, even with a top-notch railroad. But we weren't making too much time at first. So we fellows decided we'd see what we could do to hurry it up. So we cornered the conductor on the train and said, what can we do to speed this up? We kind of want to get here before the war is over. We'd like to do a little fighting. And he said, well, the train is too long. It doesn't fit on most of the sidings where we have to lay to let other trains pass us. So we lose time that way. He said if we could cut one car on this train out, we could speed it up, make much better time. So we got our heads together, and we all had, we were supposed to have done it. We didn't all do it, but we were supposed to have loaded our musette bags with a certain amount of ration material, but instead of that we loaded them up with candy bars, fruit and stuff, which was a big mistake, I learned. But anyway, we had no idea it was going to take a week to cross India. Well, that day after we talked to the conductor, we were speeding up. That's true, we did speed up a little. But of course in the we would get something in the kitchen car that they would prepare, put in our mess kits. Well, we had no way to wash our mess kit. We had no way to get a fresh drink of water except our canteen. And we arranged with the engineer of the train while we were laying at a siding. If he'd just give a little shot of steam out of the steam valve on the engine, he could sterilize our mess gear. So he would do that. And the next thing you know, he didn't have steam enough to get out of the siding. That kind of held us up a little. But anyway, we didn't do that too long because we were running out of rations. We discovered the next day that we weren't getting any hot food for rations. The one car the conductor cut out was the mess car.
Oh.
The one with all the rations in it, bless his heart. I think he sold it on the 5th column because we were coming to an area in India that was suffering from a complete famine, Bengal.
Mm-hmm.
People were starving. At every station we'd come into, this scene haunts me yet, but every station we'd come into, there'd be a crowd of people begging for food, anything, crackers, anything. Well, my friend and I had been hoarding. I had hoarded an orange for my last resort. I had it in my bag, and we were still in the famine zone, but we knew we weren't going to be too much longer. And a teacher, a lady teacher with a little baby and a little girl came up and asked me if I would please take her baby to Calcutta. We knew we were going to Calcutta, and give him to the orphanage there because they had no food for the baby. They couldn't feed him. Well, we couldn't do it. It bothers me.
Mm-hmm.
And then this other little girl that came up to us had a little brother, about 2, just barely walking. And she was begging for food for her brother. And so I gave her my orange. And she gave it to the little boy. And the little boy got down on his knees and kissed my foot. Bothers me to this day.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all we had.
Right.
We didn't even have hardtack. Well, we got to Calcutta the 2nd of March, and we were in Calcutta for about 10 days waiting for transportation to get from Calcutta up to Assam. We knew we were headed for Assam. That was in our orders. We were ordered to report to the 53 20th Air Defense Wing at that time the wing was headquartered in Calcutta, and we reported, but they had told us we had to go up and report to the actual wing headquarters, which was in Assam. So we got on a broad gauge railroad and went north. And as I said, the railroad system was superb. We took that for 2 days. We got up to the north part of India, and while we were waiting in the camp to get on, we occupied our time at the supply dump loading supplies on rail cars, bombs and ammo and all sorts of things. Even the officers had to go out there and load bombs on these cars. Nobody was exempt. So much for no special duties. But anyway, it was something to do. Well, we had the train all loaded except the passenger cars which carried the troops. And we went up there in 2 days, and we then came to a little narrow gauge railroad. And we couldn't go any farther on the broad gauge. That didn't go any farther in the direction we went. So we had to unload all the supplies, put them on the narrow gauge, and then we went on that for a ways. Well, we were on that for 2 days, and and we got up. We were now following the Brahmaputra River up the valley. We had crossed the Ganges while we were on the broad gauge, so that wasn't a problem. But we were on the wrong side of the Brahmaputra. We were on the north side. All the units were on the south side, and that's where this little tea garden railroad was going. But at least it was getting up there. So up there we got our on the March 13th, and we had to then unload all the supplies. Now, along with the other stuff that this railroad was carrying, they had a number of trucks, jeeps, ambulances, other stuff. Well, we unloaded that, and we had to load all the supplies in these vehicles. And we were ferried across the river. Now we have a truck convoy. And the 15th, we got to our big base up at Chabla, which was a huge air base. There were warehouses there, well, miles long, loaded with every kind of supplies that you can think of for China. And of course, that was the big base for the airplanes to go to China, the last air place they had, because from there they had to cross Burma, which is hostile territory, before they could get to Kunming or Chongqing in China. And now it becomes obvious what our job's going to be. Well, we left all our trucks and stuff there, and we went up to our base camp, which is at Kanjakoa, which is about 5 miles down the road from Chabla. Kanjakoa was a tea garden, Sir Thomas Lipton's tea garden. And the tea garden, of course, is where tea is grown for shipment to India. It's that part of India which is practically all tea estates. And Kanjakoa was built in the middle of it. It was supposed to be disguised, camouflaged. You see, the tea bushes are like privet shrubs. They don't grow very high, but they have to be grown in the shade to keep them tender and spicy. And so they have trees like locust trees shading them. And they figured that that would screen our little radar center from the Japanese. Very good thinking. Very good thinking.
So the trees didn't interfere with the radar?
Well, that would furnish cover, yes. Well, we're dirty. We've been on this pilgrimage for several days. We're filthy. It was late in the afternoon when we got to Kanjakoa. They were still building the radar center. They were using a temporary radar center in the planters, well, it was a bungalow. And we could set up they had set us up a temporary station, but we had temporary quarters and everything. Well, the next morning, bright and early, we didn't have any duty yet. We had signed in the evening before. We were waiting for our assignments the next morning, but they gave us the morning off. So we all went over and decided to take a shower. And we're all in our birthday suits out here, all of us controllers, getting showers at 10 in the morning. And guess what happened? A Jap air raid. Now they were actually raiding a fighter base that was about 3 miles farther on than Kanjakoa. But we discovered fairly early that a radar center is like the bullseye in a target. That is the center of all communication for that area. Everything centers there. The headquarters is there. And if you knock that out with a good bomb, why, that whole center would be in grave, well, paralysis for a while. They did have radio connections too, but not all that good. Well, anyway, here's an air raid. They had hit that air base, and then they came on over. They didn't know we were there. No, here we are in our birthday suits with no weapons except we had all brought our 45 caliber pistols with us. Or no, we had the 15 semi-automatic carbine that we'd carried from the States. No ammo with it. You can't do that when you're in transit. No ammo. So here we've got these empty, wonderful weapons. And we can't get a blooming shot out. So we run right over to the supply tent. Get us some ammunition, quick, quick. Says, I haven't got any ammo for the 15 calibers. Hasn't got here yet. Says, the only thing I got was for your 45 caliber pistol. Says, that won't do any good against aircraft. Well, I haven't got rifles here. Well, how about rifles? Got ammo for them? Yeah, got ammo for that. But we can't issue them to you. You're officers. Officers aren't authorized to carry rifles. So we waited the air raid out in our birthday suit. But we took appropriate methods to get some rifle ammo fairly soon through other sources.
Now, was this place, did you stay in this one base then?
That was Kanjakoa. That was our day base. You see, our duty there was to protect the main supply base at Chabwa. There were millions of dollars worth of supplies there, and we were their sole base to protect it. It was a big base. They had airplanes. And there were 3 other little airfields around our radar center. Our radar would work, but it was only spasmodic. That's when the mental arithmetic came in handy. You'd get a plane up there. We only had P-40 Warhawks. That was the best they had. Well, that was a good plane. It was a very good plane. They were using them in China. Chenault was using them. He had some that he managed to save over there. The trouble with them was that at this point, the Japanese were using Zeros, and they were 2,000 feet above us. We couldn't get that high. We couldn't engage them. But our boys were pretty sharp, our pilots. They figured out we'd vector them out there on our radar. We'd get them out, get them under the target. They'd stall out, and they'd shoot them in the belly. Or try to. We knocked a few down from time to time.
All right.
But our second duty was protecting the airlift across Burma from interruption by the Japanese from their big base at Michina. Our air traffic would go close enough to it so they could interrupt it. Well, we finally changed our route a little bit and took it up over the north end of Burma at Fort Hertz, which was in friendly hands, and bypassed it, but it was several hundred miles farther and took longer and carried smaller loads. So we knew that sooner or later one of our jobs was going to be, or going to have to be, if this airlift was going to make all the difference it should, we had to capture Michina. That's all there was to it. And it was pretty heavily fortified. We'll get to that.
Okay. Now I've only got a little bit of time left on this tape here. Can you tell me a little bit about the daily life on the base? Like, what did you eat and where did you sleep and that kind of thing?
Well, we controllers had 8-hour shifts, and we'd work 3 controllers to a shift. You'd have your main controller, your wing controller, on duty. When he sat in the chair, he was the boss. Even the general wouldn't come in and tell him what to do. No way. No, sir. Nobody could tell the senior controller what to do. He had his instructions how the general wanted the interceptions, to be conducted and to do, but it was up to this senior controller to do them. Now he had sitting next to him an air identification officer, which was another controller, and it was his job to identify all the planes on your ops board, which ones are friendly on these little Christmas trees. If it's red, it's enemy. If it's green, it's friendly. If it's not identified, why, it's his job to identify it.
Okay. At this point, my tape
Officer that was in charge of anti-aircraft artillery, and he would also send the alert to all the places that needed alerting, the air bases, the supply depots, the trains, the everything. That was his job. But he would, the controller would tell him when he wanted ACAC, and it was up to him to coordinate it. I liked ACAC. We always let them go first. And then there would be a civilian in the control room that would give the warning to the civilian population, all the different areas that should have air raid warnings. These three aircraft controllers, of course, would only be necessary during daylight hours at first. Controllers were on duty 24 hours a day, 8-hour shifts. You have 3 shifts a day, and you'd get your rest in between as best you could, because many of us got daytime jobs that the general thought of that needed doing, like running the kitchen and doing all sorts of things, the supply office, such stuff. But anyway, the general was very cute about these extra jobs. Incidentally, I mentioned that I had learned to speak Paka Hindi because I thought it would be a good thing to know. I want to save my ears. If I had gotten in a plane that went down in an area where the natives didn't speak English and I could speak their language, I could explain to them that I was friendly, because they like to cut off the Japanese ears just to show how many they disposed of. But wore them on a necklace. But anyway, we did the best we could with these P-40s. We had those quite a while. Now, until the Middle East situation got cleared up, which it did by May 20th of 42, is when the Rommel force surrendered in
43.
Tunis.
Yeah.
And then we could fly things across North Africa as supplies, and we could eliminate a lot of shipment time, and we could bring in planes. But they still had to come into Karachi, because the Japanese would pull cute little raids just to let us know that they were still doing business. Well, we had about, as I recall, about 12 controllers in our unit, and we were all not lacking for jobs to do or whatever, and we were still planning. Now, when we first got to India, the headquarters of 10th Air Force was at Calcutta, but by May, the headquarters of 10th Air Force moved up to Kanjakoa, and by that time the radar center was in full swing. I forgot to mention, now, Air Force people are not supposed to be combat troops. Definitely not. However, in an air raid, why, your control center, your control building, you have foxholes dug with machine guns all around it, and it's stationed at various places in the perimeter. Well, we had to, any of our enlisted personnel or commissioned personnel that weren't actively engaged in the control center had to go out and man these positions for 15 minutes, supposedly. Now, as it happened, this being a British theater, down the road a couple of miles from where we were, there was a regiment of Highland troops in kilt and bagpipe, some of the best. They'd been in Europe before. They were out here more or less for rest and relaxation. But anyway, they, as soon as we sent the raid out, you know, that we were going to be raided, why, well, the first thing that would happen would be, now this was standard procedure, we discovered. A lot of the native population was pro-Jap, and we had telephone lines to all of our stations around, different radio stations, different airfields, and so on. 6 hours before a raid would happen, all the phone lines went dead. There was no point in trying to repair them because they'd just be cut somewhere else. Now, what the nasty boys didn't understand was that we also had radio connections to all of our bases, which they didn't knock out. Now, we would know that when the phones went dead, that within 6 hours, we were going to be raided. That was SOP. They generally planned their raids for around 10 in the morning. I don't know why they did that, but all of the labor at our camp were native Indian people. And of course, if we were getting raided, they'd run hide in the jungle. So they'd just be starting lunch in the kitchen, and they'd all go hide in the lunch or in the jungle, and lunch would either burn or get overcooked, or if you got it, you were lucky. But anyway, they were doing the best they could with what they had. But we could figure things by, well, now we knew when the phones went dead in 6 hours you're going to be visited. And you might get some more visits later, but the phones would still be likely to be dead. But we were concerned that our radio connection would get to those Highlanders, because they had to come up and man our guns. And they had artillery too. And they were damn good with it. Excuse the word. But anyway, we always knew when our call got through, because we'd hear that war pipe. They'd be blowing the war pipe, and they'd be coming down the road on the double, and taking over the positions, so that we could devote our full attention to the raid.
All right. Now, when the Japanese made an air raid, how large would it be, or what kind of planes would they use?
Well, they would be small raids to begin with. The first raid we had was 10 airplanes. That was a little small, actually, more or less to explore and see what was going on. Now, we always had a Photo Joe going over every morning. His whole job was to photograph the area there around the base with the supplies and the air base, get photos, so their intelligence would know what was going on. Well, we couldn't reach him, and he used to get downright nasty. He would get on our wavelength, and he would, "Yankee, ha ha, Yankee, you can't get me, I'm up here taking your picture." And he was being downright nasty, and he'd get away with it. Well, that business, and we couldn't get him, that was true. Not with the P-40s. Well, eventually, a few months later, we began to get some, see, the 10th Air Force had the lowest priority of any theater of war in supplies. I suppose because they thought the British ought to supply something. But anyway, we began to get some 47s and some 51s and some 39s. Well, our pilots didn't like 39s. They called them widowmakers. They weren't enthusiastic about them, and actually we didn't really need them. They were basically good for ground work. If later we might have needed them, but not at this beginning. Well, the 47s were very good. They were slow to gain altitude, but once they gained in a dive, they were terrific. And they were great for putting bombs in pillboxes and things like that. They weren't so hot at interceptions. But the 51s, that little plane was the best thing that anybody ever invented. Well, we got a few of those. We just got a few at first. And then by dribbles and drabs, we got others in due time. Our 3 different air squadrons that we had. One day, our photo Joe came over, giving us the raspberry about, you can't do anything to me, you can't catch me, I'm going to take your picture. And there's a 51 on his tail that he didn't know. The pilot in the 51 said, look behind you, Joe. And that was the last photo Joe we ever had. But we found a way. The Japanese used to interfere with our radio connections, and that was serious. You know, when we were expecting a raid, we couldn't have jamming, and they could do a pretty good job of jamming. But we found out one thing that we could do that was, I think, I don't know who invented it, one of the enlisted men or who, but we discovered how we could stop that jamming. All you had to do was sing a few bars from the Mikado on the radio. Now, the Japanese were absolutely forbidden to listen to anything disrespectful of the Mikado, so they'd get right off the air.
So Gilbert and Sullivan became a defensive tactic.
Yes.
Okay.
We had, I bought some records. I bought some records in Calcutta. I liberated a Victrola from the Special Services tent, and so we had records we could play for entertainment and so on in our camp. We were more or less permanently based, and I got a full recording of the Mikado operetta, just so anyone could learn it.
Right.
It was a lot of fun, but, well, it usually worked. But anyway, I think that was an interesting point to know. Well, now, I mentioned that in May of 44
or 44? Yeah.
The headquarters 10th Air Force moved up to Kanjakoa, took over a bunch of our buildings. We had lived in tents until that time, English tents, which are very big tents. They hold 6 people, but they soak up water. And in the rainy season, that's not an advantage. They get heavy and whoop, they cave in. Well, anyway, when the 10th Air Force came over, they got some buildings built for their staff people and whatnot, and they moved us out of our tents. We had complained enough, so they moved us to some native bashas, little bamboo and mud huts. Our whole unit moved into bashas, which are waterproof. The only disadvantage to a basha is that they all had thatch roofs. Now that's good, keeps out rain as good as any roofing material you ever saw. So that part was fine. But when the rainy season starts, it rains straight from about the end of April until the end of September. It rains starts out gradually, but each day it increases until by the end of May it's raining steadily until the end of August. Harder at times than others, but that rain on the roof had a disadvantage. Things like mice and rats and snakes would get up in that thatch and hole up. And you'd be sitting in your basha reading a good book or listening to a record or something, and plop! Here comes a mouse or a rat. Well, that part, why, you can handle. But suppose a crate or a sidewinder or something like that comes bobbing in there. If a sidewinder bites you, or well, there's no antidote for a crate, but a sidewinder, you've got 30 minutes. Now that's hardly time to get a tourniquet on. We had one guy that got bitten, the only medical case where a fellow that was bitten by a sidewinder that lived, because most of the time they'd bite you where you couldn't slip a tourniquet on in time. Well, this guy sat on it, and I don't know yet how they managed to get an antidote on, but that one fellow lived to a happy old age. But then, of course, you had these bigger snakes too. You'd get cobras and different things. And, a cobra 12 feet is not unusual for a cobra, up to 16 or more. And cobras are a nasty snake. They are what they call the gangster. That's what the natives figured. They hunt people. They don't just attack those that bother them. They actually hunt people. Now, you can't outrun a cobra. All of us officers, at least, some of the enlisted men, carried a cane while we were in India, a springy cane. I had a rattan cane with 6 inches of lead in the tip. Now that's how you fight a snake. You see someone, and you know very well you can't outrun him. But you can start to outrun him, and he'll get up speed and come at you, and you sidestep. He can't turn that fast. You hit him and break his neck. That's your only defense. And you better get out something to shoot with and finish him off with a submachine gun or a 45 or a 15 caliber semi-automatic. But get him, because he wouldn't leave automatically. And they were not too uncommon, fortunately. Living in India is not all peaches and cream. The climate is hot in the summer. In the off-season, the monsoon season, when that was over, the winter monsoon would be cool, actually cool, when the breeze comes down from the mountains. No rain, you knew very well. We had to be fairly adept as controllers. We had to take a course in weather forecasting. We had to be aware of the weather in order to, that was another facet of our work, not just intercepting enemy planes, but of actually mounting raids of our own to go get them. And we'd have to know what the weather was going to be in order to take advantage of it. We had, in addition to our radar, something that was a great deal of help up in this mountain range. Now the Japanese, when they would come to attack us, would come at low altitude. You couldn't pick it up with the radar until they came up over that mountain range. And that was within maybe 30 miles of your first ACAG positions, and which is instant timing. Well, we had ground spotters up in those hills, some of them natives, some of them Americans. We'd send little details up there, a few men with field glasses and a radio, and they could spot enemy planes coming and notify us a fair amount of time ahead of time, which was very handy. Some of the native ground spotters actually would set up business fairly close to the Japanese airports. The Japanese sometimes might catch them, but usually they didn't. All the natives apparently look alike. So they were very helpful, but we used them extensively, as well as the radar.
All right.
But the Japanese, now our technique of fighting them was when they'd come in low and we knew it, they had to gain altitude to come over the mountains. That was the last thing they'd do, is get up to the altitude they wanted for bombing. The first thing they wanted to do was bomb. And of course, when they're gaining altitude and we'd spot them, we'd turn the ack loose and force them, because our ack was pretty accurate, as good as you'd expect and maybe better, but it would force them to get higher than they wanted to go, really. Now, that was a big help. And now, getting down to, you mentioned the size of these raids. They, toward the end of the war, when the Japanese were getting forced back in Burma, I haven't gotten you up to that yet, but when we were actually going back to recapture Myitkyina, and they had what I considered a bonsai charge. It was in the very last days of the war, last few months. And their planes were moving farther south in Burma all the while, the ones they had. We had already attained pretty close to air superiority in North Burma from our side of the 10th Air Force. We had light bombers as well as enemy aircraft, hostile aircraft. But the most planes I ever had in the air at one time were 75 of ours. Mm-hmm. And they had about 75 coming in. Now that was an interesting day for several reasons. They had everything that they could find that could fly, that was equipped to shoot. And they came in. And I had my 3 squadrons. If I took off everything from my 3 squadrons, I could put 75 planes in the air. Normally they'd figure 20 from an air base. 5 would be being serviced or something. But as it happened, when they got an air raid warning, they suddenly got serviced faster. So I found myself with 75 of our own. And it happened that there was a squadron from the 14th Air Force in India that had come back to replace their aircraft with 51s. And they were up there at one of our air bases waiting. You know, they were all gassed up and armed, ready to take off for China. They'd been sent over for R&R when this raid took place. So our technique was, we didn't want that whole 75 crashing out there at once. Just be too many planes in the air at once. So we'd take a squadron at a time, send them in, haul them out, and hit them with another. I had sent my first squadron in. I was on the radio getting ready to send my second squadron in, and my name was Klondike. That was, and then later in Burma it was Grey Goose. But anyway, I was Klondike, and I get a strange voice on my radio calling Klondike. This is Tiger 1. Can we come to your party, please? And it was this Flying Tiger squadron. Mm-hmm. I said, you surely can, and welcome. And he says, what'll we do? I said, Angels 15, orbit checkpoint Charlie, and I'll give you further orders. I'll tell you when to go in. And so he goes over to the checkpoint and orbits and waits his orders. He's already at the right altitude. 15 angels is 15,000. And that would be about the flight of these Japs. Well, anyway, I sent my second wave in, and I was planning to, I forgot all about the bloomin' flying tigers orbiting the checkpoint. I was so doggone busy with my planes, getting my third squadron airborne and poised, ready to relieve the others, getting the first squadron back refueled and so on. And a voice cuts in on my radio again. Said, Klondike, thank you. Thank you. They're heading right into our lap. We'll take it from here. I got credit for that, but I never gave the order. But they just happened into that group that was orbiting this checkpoint. I never said anything to anybody about it. But we were darn glad to have them. Boy, did they handle the Japanese too. Well, at the end of the day, the next day, we got every single Jap plane. We lost a few planes, but nothing like they did. Not very many, actually, because by that time in the war, their pilots were lousy. But the next day, before the group went back to China, the leader of their squadron came in and thanked me for sending them in. He said, thank you for the entertainment. He said, we're very happy to help. I said, we're very happy to have had you. And so they went back to China. We never heard from them again. So I can truthfully say that I actually commanded a squadron of Flying Tigers too, just by accident.
All right. Now, in later 1944, that was the period when Merrill's Marauders, the American kind of commando unit, was sent into Burma. They fought their way through the jungles, and they got as far as Myitkyina. What can you tell me about your contact with that group?
All right. They camped right next to us. By that time, they were waiting orders, to go to Burma. But the Japanese at that point were trying to break through that mountain chain. They did, but farther down, and they hit General Slim's 8th Army, British. At times, that front line was the distance of a tennis court between them. It was touch and go. Some of our boys used to take their leave time and go down and fight with them. But anyway, Merrill's Marauders came, and they were camped there in temporary tents and so on, getting shots and stuff like that. They were pretty heavily infected with the malaria, and they were not in top-class condition. They never should have been sent. Never should, really. But anyway, they were being doped up and whatnot. General Merrill was a very perfect gentleman. I enjoyed talking with him. At lunch, he had to eat with me because the officers all ate in one mess. The generals, by that time I was a first lieutenant. But anyway, we had our own separate quarters, the controllers and so on. But the Air Force officers all had their own camps and so forth. Well, the Marauders knew what they were doing. They were experts. And General Stilwell had to have combat troops. Well, he couldn't get any from the British. They were using all they had to combat that trip down at Imphal. And so Stilwell had made a deal with Chiang Kai-shek and borrowed 2 Chinese divisions which were trained by American officers. They'd been trained over at Karachi and brought in. So he had some combat troops. So he starts going in then by land over a mountain trail, which we had one American unit of engineers, combat engineers, that were building this. We got some more engineers later, but to make this into a road, the Lido Road. And of course, once they got the road in, why, the troops, actually could be moved in. And that's when we decided to attack at the beginning of the rainy season, which Stilwell had figured. I've never forgiven that man. But he figured this attack out. We were going to send some Air Force men in too, and set up a radar station. But, well, anyway, the marauders would go down out over the road, and the Chinese divisions, and the ground troops had gotten down to within 60 miles of Michina, and then they got blocked by the Japanese, who by that time had begun to retreat from Imphal. So there were still a lot of Jap combat troops down that far. But Imphal or Michina was not heavily guarded. They didn't expect an attack. And so the marauders marched. They wanted to march down, not go by air, but to be taken, marching. And then they went over this little mountain range between the Chindwin Valley, which is where the Lido Road was going down, and the other road that came up from Michina, just a jungle trail actually, and they would come down that into Michina. Nobody would be expecting them. It'd be a complete surprise. Now at the same time they were going to do that, they figured it would take them 3 days to get over that mountain. But General Stilwell and the weathermen misfigured it. They figured that the rainy season was going to be late, so it would not be impossible on foot. The rainy season wasn't rain. The first day, there was going to be a force that would go in partly by glider and partly by transport, and land right on the Michina airport and secure it. And that was where our radar unit went in, and the combat engineers, which would fight as infantry, which they could do. And we secured the airport in a very short time. I wasn't able to go with that first wave, with the gliders and whatnot. I had jungle rot in my right foot, and they had to leave half of the radar center back at Kanjakoa to handle the duties there. They only took half of our controllers and stuff with it down there to set up. We had a temporary radar center going, which didn't do much work at the first. The Japanese snipers would shoot out the equipment. But anyway, the Japanese were not anticipating it, of course. And we did secure it and a certain perimeter around it. But then they managed to counterattack. Well, all in all, the rainy season started the next day. So we couldn't land any more supplies on the strip. The engineers had gotten the pits from our bombings filled, along with their other work down there, so it could be used when the weather got good. Well, there were days when the monsoon starts. There would be times when the rain wouldn't be so heavy, and if the ground wouldn't be too muddy, you could go in, and we could begin to get other things in. But the marauders going over that hill had gotten rained on in that 3 days, and they'd go 1 foot forward and 2 forward back. It took them a day longer than they figured, so they didn't get there the first day. They got there the 4th day. They did all right. They pushed the Japanese far enough back so that we could get planes in and equipment. We could parachute supplies in and stuff and hold it. And in due time, Stilwell got his 2 Chinese divisions to move and break the stalemate they had up at Mogong where the ruby mines were. I got some ruby rings. But anyway, they didn't get there though for quite a few days, even though they did manage to break through the roadblock. But they got there.
Okay. Now, did the 10th Air Force provide combat support or just supplies?
Oh no, we supplied combat support. That's when our ground support came in handy. It took us 3 months to capture Michina, completely captured. We had to dig it out pillbox by pillbox. Bombing wouldn't hurt them. They had made them bomb-proof. The only way you could hurt them was to come in and skip bomb them. They had to have a slot there for their machine guns. If you could slide a nice bomb through that slit, you could give them some hot tea. Or if you had a bazooka, now we did have bazookas. We had no artillery. We couldn't bring in artillery for quite a while over the road. It was too heavy for the road. But the bazookas with those shots were very effective too, if we could get one to go through that slit. But 1 pillbox at a time, yes. And we had our control box down there, would steer these planes that we'd send down with the bombs on the wings. I used to listen to the chit-chat on the radio, and I'd hear the ground controller saying, "You see those 5 palm trees down there in that break in the road?" "Yep," pilot says. "Well, there's a pillbox right in the middle of it. Take care of it." So they'd go and give them a skip bomb, or try to. Sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. But they could make a return call. But yes, and all the way down in Burma, we were backing them up. We were behind Merrill's Marauders and some of their missions, giving them airborne supplies and backing them up. And we were also, because we had no way to treat wounded down there until we fully captured Michina and could build a temporary hospital, we just had these little, we didn't have MASH units, we just had first aid stations. And what we did in our unit then up at Kanjakoa, we had some flying boats, dumbos. That was the code word for the flying boats. And we would fly those in, they'd bring the wounded over to a river or a lake where we could land, and we could bring back a load of wounded to the big hospital at Chabwa, which we did during the daylight hours. Couldn't do anything at night, but you didn't do much fighting at night. Our patrol, our staff unit at night in the control room would be reduced. We'd keep positions of all the planes on our, because the airlift to China, now this was interesting. I discovered that the planes going to China, 1 every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day, rain or shine, weather's no excuse. And you'd load it till it got to the point where the pilot would flap his wings to take off. Well, we lost a lot of planes, but we saved a lot of pilots too. The natives would rescue and bring back for us up through Fort Hertz and friendly ground stations and so on. Oh, those natives were wonderful. Dr. Seagraves helped that, the Burma surgeon. He was wonderful. I met him. He was the chief surgeon for the 10th Air Force. And General Stilwell appointed him.
Okay. Now, did you spend pretty much your whole time on the one base, or did they move you to Burma at the end of the war?
Oh no, I got 2 Bronze Stars. Heaven knows you don't fight them at a radar set. No. Yes, after Michina got secured, well, they immediately then started down the road to Bommel, if they could capture Baumel, it was just a short distance to Lashio, and they could link up with the old Burma Road.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would have a land link to China, save 600 miles, and they could transport land convoys, which saved a lot of planes and gas and so on. Well, I went down to Baumel directly, not to Michina first, although I did get a Bronze Star for the Michina campaign because of the supply situation and so on. But I had to stay back at Kanjakoa with a detachment they left up there because we still had these Dumbos to bring in and supplies to send out and other things. Yes, well, I was at Baumel for a few months. I got another Bronze Star for Baumel campaign. We did actually have occasions to do some shooting to protect ourselves. And yes, I have on my Asia Pacific ribbon 2 Bronze Stars.
Okay. Now, you said you had to do some shooting to protect yourself. Who or what were you shooting?
I never got any complaints from the Japanese.
But were there Japanese ground troops near you, or?
Oh Lord, yes, they had snipers in the jungle and all sorts of things. You never knew when you were going to meet one. And we weren't advancing in force. We were advancing along the roads and things. But sometimes you'd be attacked. You'd be attacked by air. That counted too. Yes, I never actually went in the jungle and hunted for them. No way, I was protecting our radar units. No, we had our last radar station. We were up at Michina for 3 months, and then it took another couple months to capture Baumel, so we went down and put in a radar station there. And this was breaking down. We got a few extra radar controllers, but it was making it so we'd only have 3 controllers at a base. Well, you can't run much of a base with 3 controllers. Well, I got over my jungle rot in my foot. It took about 3 months. My roommate was our surgeon up there at Kanjakoa, and he wanted to amputate my foot and save it. And I said, no, I was born with 2 feet. I want to be buried with 2 feet. If you touch my foot, I'll shoot you. So he said, all right, have it your way. So I had to bathe my foot twice a day for 15 minutes each time in the strongest disinfectants you could get to kill that, which was a fungus disease, this jungle rot. It was a serious one. A lot of fellows lost limbs and things on account of it. You'd get just a simple little cut. I had trimmed my toenail too closely and I got a little tiny cut. That's how I got jungle rot. Stupid, stupid, stupid. I've been very careful with my toenails ever since.
Okay. Now, did the men on your base have trouble with malaria?
Yes. When our unit first got to India, our malaria rate was 114%. Now, I never had malaria, so some poor duck got it twice, and I didn't get it at all. But we discovered some things that helped. The engineers, before they got too tied up with the Lido Road, went around and were spraying the ponds and so on to control mosquitoes, and the malaria rate went way down finally. And we discovered some things. You take your Atabrin tablets every day. Yes, indeed, whether you like them or not. There's a officer right there, dole out the pills and see that you take them. So that rate went down, but no, I never got that. But some of our fellows did, and some of them never recovered. Had to be returned to the States and replaced. Some very fine controllers. But when it got down to 3 controllers per shift, We'd have 3 8-hour shifts. Then our extra duties. I was the supply officer at one point. I was the transportation officer at one point. I was the mess officer for several months. I was in charge of the native cooks in the kitchen up there in India. My cooks were Hindus and Mohammedans, and I even had 3 Christians, Indians, and try to make out a menu for that gang. Mm-hmm. The Hindus can't make anything that has dairy products in it on account of sacred cows. Mm-hmm. The Muslims can't do anything that has pork in it. No. So I'm making a menu that has to be served to the troops every day. I have to go get the menu from the supply base. That's where my quartermaster training came in. I could sometimes squeeze out some extra items that weren't on the menu that were pretty tasty.
Now, did the cooks cook it in Indian style, or did they try to cook American food?
We had a mess sergeant that was an American, but he didn't speak Hindu. He wrote the menu. I translated it for the cooks, and they helped me with my Hindi, so I got to be fairly decent at speaking Pukka Hindi.
Okay. Now, did your ability to speak Hindi give you some other assignments?
Yes.
What other kinds of things did you do with that?
Well, one of my other assignments, because I had a perfect cover for it, I had to go to the warehouse to get our rations every day at 9 o'clock. And I would have to get certain things from the native bazaar, fresh vegetables and fruit, the ones that we were able to eat. But I would be listening to these people talking. Now, I was in counter-espionage, too. I was a regular James Bond. I would report to intelligence what these people were talking about. But I must not let them know that I could speak Hindi down in the market. No, or nothing but the pidgin English Hindi that we were using at camp. I had one man assigned to help me. They gave me to help me. I never knew who the other counter-espionage people were, in case I got captured. I never knew what the other men were doing. I did not know until after the war. I was having fun. Actually, you see, I had a cover. I had a reason to be down there getting supplies and things. And they wouldn't suspect a dumb lieutenant of knowing anything. So once in a while, I'd drop a piece of information on purpose. We were doing it deliberately to offset their doggone intelligence, because we knew they would know Saigon Sal or Tokyo Rose would broadcast to us every day and tell us what we were going to do. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I would mention to this sergeant, he was a wonderful sergeant, American. He drove the Jeep. He was no cook. But he could forge orders. He could break locks. He could do all sorts of very good things. He could fix motors. Well, he was helping me. So I'd mark to the sergeant, "Hey, Sergeant, we've got to get back to camp early today. We've got a mission going out for Mandalay." That's all I'd say. But somebody'd pick that up and they'd get it down to the Jap intelligence, and pretty soon we'd hear Tokyo Rose, or not Tokyo Rose so much as Saigon Sal. "Well, you men are going to bomb Mandalay today. Well, we're ready for you." Well, we weren't going near Mandalay. We were going to go bomb Bull Mine or some other place.
Now, when you were doing this kind of work, do you think you got any information that was useful?
Whatever I heard, I turned in, yes.
But what kinds of things would you hear?
Well, they would tip you off as to things that, troop movements or whatnot that they knew might be coming into your area, especially after we got down in Burma. Mm-hmm. Yes, we wouldn't know because the Japanese would be taking jungle trails too.
All right. Now, where were you when the war ended? Where were you at the end of the war?
At the end of the war, I was at Michina when the war was over. I managed to get an impacted wisdom tooth, two of them. So I got everything except malaria. But while I was at Bommel, I got Bommel straightened out in 3 months. And this impacted wisdom tooth, our CO decided that I better go back to Michina, where they had a hospital. They had a dental unit there, the only one in Burma. And this dentist had a foot pedal drill and all that good stuff. Well, he ordered me back to Michina, and there was a troop convoy leaving Bommel, taking some stuff up to Michina, convoy load up there. And so he ordered me to lead the convoy. I just couldn't go along for the ride. I led the convoy back to Michina over the Burma, well, the Lido Road, which was not easy. It was a 2-lane road supposedly, but I met a Chinese convoy headed, because by that time they could get to the Burma Road and go to China. But this Chinese convoy met me halfway up to Michina on this 2-lane road. It's no wider than, hardly wider than you need for 2 lanes. And I got the outside because British traffic is left. Well, this Chinese bunch has got the side toward the mountain, and they're playing chicken with me. I'm in the front Jeep, and they're up there bumping my Jeep with their doggone truck, their lead truck. I don't know if he was hoping to push me over or not. He didn't, but my driver, Eddie Rakowski, was a darn good driver. And I saw what they were doing, and I took my carbine and I aimed it at this truck driver, and I worked the bolt, aimed right at him. And I wasn't bothered with any more bumps on the Jeep. He didn't know it, but we had no ammo when we were traveling.
All right. Okay. Then how long after that was it before they sent you home?
Well, let's see. I got back to I got back there in so that I was back at Michina for 2 months. It took a while after I got there. I did get my teeth fixed. Actually, no, it was only about 6 weeks. I couldn't get it fixed right away, and I got thanked by the unit. At the time, just after I got back there, we got orders for our unit to reassemble because another radar unit came to relieve us, the 96th. We were the 51st, and they had taken over our duties in the radar room. But we got an order for all our different units. See, we had a unit at Michina, a unit at Bommel, as well as a unit still at Kansakoa. But to get them all back together and go to China. Now, we didn't understand what was going on. We got that order in tail end of July, beginning of August. We didn't know until after the war, but we had been building airfields in India and in Burma. We had enlarged Michina large enough to handle B-29s, and we actually had some B-29s that were doing heavy bombing clear down in Burma and Siam, Malaya. But we were equipped to handle the A-bomb. So if that deal at Iwo Jima had not been satisfactory, we could have done it. from one of our airfields in Burma.
All right.
But we didn't know, we knew nothing about the A-bomb till after it happened.
Okay. And then when did you get back to the States?
Well, now, that's a story in itself. We came by ship again. It took us a few weeks to get from Michina back to Kanjakoa to the sign out. We had to be checked out. All the stuff we'd been issued, supplies had to be accounted for, and you had to be signed, you know, that they'd been received back. We could leave nothing behind us. Had to tear down our camp and everything. And then from Kanjakoa we went back down to an air base in India, where the big B-29 base had been the first one, Paradoba. And we were there for a couple weeks, managed to get dysentery on some shrimp that they thought would be a treat for us. I've had it all. We went back to Karachi, and we sailed December the 10th, 1945 from Karachi. And we sailed on the General Baloo, which was a big hospital ship, and had, I don't know, a couple thousand men on it. And we went through the Arabian Gulf and up through Suez. They had swept a channel through mines, and it was a delightful ride back until we got to Gibraltar. And once we got to Gibraltar, we went out into the ocean, and it was the biggest doggone storm they'd ever had. Even the big aircraft carriers were sent back to port. But our Scotch captain wanted to get home, and so we kept going. And we managed at one point to damage got a little hole in the bow of the ship. So we got one of the quieter days in the storm, lowered some welders over the side to fix it, and we continued our trip, but at a little slower pace. But anyway, that hard-headed captain, when we got to New York, we got there the evening of December 31st. And so we had to lay outside the harbor. They were having a pilot strike in New York at that time, and you couldn't bring those big ships in without a harbor pilot. Mm-hmm. Absolutely not. Well, January 1st, early in the morning, the captain gets steam up. We steam into the lower harbor, and by tradition, every ship in the harbor has to blow the whistle to welcome you for the Happy New Year. And our ship had to blow the whistle back to acknowledge it. We were being saluted by tugboats, ferry boats, everything you could think of. And we lost all our steam before we got clear up to the inner harbor. We were in it, but we had to wait a little bit till we got some more steam. But our captain brought that ship in and docked it on Manhattan Island himself, and never even bumped the pier. And it's a darn good thing he did, because if we'd had to wait till the strike was over and we got back, there were a number of things we could think of for those strikers that might happen to them, might injure their health. Right. Because we were anxious to be back too.
So when were you actually discharged?
Well, I was actually discharged, from as soon as we got back into the harbor, we were sent to Camp Kilmer. And from there we were sent immediately to the camp nearest your home. uh, which would, in our case, was Camp Atterbury, because Rockford wasn't running anymore,
Right.
Camp Grant. So I took a train home. But my discharge, my actual discharge was dated March the 12th. But actually, I was home in January. I got home January very early on, just 3 days from the time we got in the harbor. Why, we were back over at Atterbury. The train service was extremely good. And of course, I discovered that we had terminal leave promotions. So I came home captain. And I went into the Korean War as a captain because I stayed in the reserve.
Okay. Now, did they send you to Korea during the Korean War, or did you stay home?
Well, I was a senior controller, and we were very concerned. It was not known by the general public, but we were firmly expecting Russia to aid the North Koreans. And if that were the case, we knew they had planes that would take the Pahl and back. So I was in the reserve, but I would have had to go back even if it hadn't been. I was recalled immediately. I didn't even have 2 weeks' notice once they jumped us in Korea. And they started building the DO line. Well, being a senior controller and a former teacher, among other things, I was in the 752nd AC&W Squadron, and I was sent to Empire, which is 22 miles from Traverse City.
I know Empire.
And we were training controllers and radar units. They sent us double strength rookies. We were giving basic training and training for radar units for Korea. I did not go to Korea. I was simply an instructor.
And how long did you, or what dates did you serve during that?
I was over there for a little over 12 months.
So 1950 to 51?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, that was a story in itself. My wife was very angry. We were married in 48. I always said I got my license to fight twice on the same day. July 28th, that's when I got my officer's commission and my my wedding date. But my wife didn't think that was funny. She disliked that highly. So she made a deal with me. She was an Irish girl, never bet with an Irish girl. She said, I'll make a deal.
We were talking at the point when the last tape ended, you were talking about how you had been called up for the Korean War, and you were assigned to an aircraft control and warning unit in Michigan, and then you were talking about your wife, and you said your wife had made a bet with you about the Korean War.
You want me to talk about my wife?
Well, talk about the part about the bet for the war that didn't get on the tape.
Well, okay. We were recalled to Selfridge, and that's where our unit was formed. And we were ordered up to Empire. We even helped build that base because it wasn't finished. And my wife and I had an argument about it because I'd been in the reserve when I was recalled, of course. But she didn't drink coffee at the time we were married in 48. And or she did drink coffee, but I didn't, and I didn't like coffee. So, in the middle of August, in 50, she meets me at the door with a yellow paper in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. And she says, drink it.
So you had made the bet and you lost the bet because they recalled you.
I lost the bet. All the officers in that unit were reserve recall except the colonel. We were all controllers from different places in the world.
All right. And also, then tell me a little bit about the activities on the base. You said you were worried about communist spies.
Yes. Well, we had to give these guys that we were training basic training. So these are just stories. But we, each of us officers, we were all captains because we'd all been lieutenants and got terminal leave promotions. But anyway, and they acknowledged them. After all, it was legally a captain. So we were out giving these guys PT and other things and serving in the control unit. We actually had to calibrate that unit. It wasn't ready to use, but it was the best in service. A1 radar units, we were taking no chances. Well, anyway, we had to calibrate it and get it so it was in working order. Well, I had a unit out here and I was given a marching on the lower level because the enlisted men were not cleared to go up to the radar level, just certain ones in the signal corps and so on. But none of the rest were not cleared to go up there for security reasons. Well, I've got my guys and I'm marching them back and forth on the company street. And I decide we're gonna have to do something. I kept hearing these guys behind me talking about these old retreads. And just wait, by the time it gets difficult, a Jeep will be here and they'll be riding a Jeep. And so I figured, like the devil I will. So I marched them to the base of the hill, and that hill was pretty high, Empire Dune. Mm-hmm. Well, I said, okay, now we're going to do this dune, and I'm going to time you, and I'm going to lead you. And I led them up that hill. I double timed them up the hill. When I got them up there, I took a look at my watch, and I said, you can do it in 5 seconds better than you did. We're going to march down, we're going to do it again until you get it right. I never heard another remark about officer retreads or anything else. I was still, at that time, which was barely 5 years after being in service, I was still in top physical condition. I wouldn't back away from any 6 men.
All right.
That was the fault of my infantry basic.
Right. Okay. Now, you had mentioned while the camera was off that there were actually communist spies in Michigan at the time of the Korean War.
Yes, the communists were very active here, trying to find out about our quality of our radar station. You know, they knew we had super duper radar, but they had no idea what its qualifications were, nor how accurate it was. And we also had Tipsy 1Bs for altitude checking and some other equipment that they wanted to know about. They wanted to find out just, I suppose, the size of this base, what the range of our radar would be, all the things that they could learn. So we were told, the FBI told us, which bars these guys hung out in. They knew about them, they were shadowing them, and we found where they'd get a ride out to the base and try to sneak under the chain wire fence around the base at some hidden point in the brush. And we would make a daily walk around the perimeter of the base looking for places where they'd try to penetrate, but as far as we know, none of them ever did. We thought one did. One day, or one night, rather, it was one night, one of our officers was walking home from his duty at midnight from the Empire Bluff down to Empire, where his quarters were, and he started out, it was in midwinter, and he's half asleep. He's walking down this winding road, which is fairly steep, and here comes what he described as a guy in a fur coat and wearing a fur hat that came up and was walking along beside him for a little ways. And he tried to talk to him, and this guy wouldn't talk to him. He just grunted. And finally, this guy just walks off through the woods, still on walking. So he reported it the next day to the colonel, and we went out and we looked for the tracks in the snow. He'd been walking with a bear on his hind legs. It might have been a Russian in disguise with a fur coat and a fur hat, but it was a big black bear.
Right. Now, when you got back home after World War II, did you go back to being a teacher, or did you do something different?
No, I was all of that. My certificate was still valid, and I had signed a contract to teach. But you see, teachers at that time only worked 9 months a year. You only got paid 9 months a year. So teachers did odd jobs in the summer. Well, in my summers, I worked at the land title business down here, and I did jobs at the courthouse in the Register of Deeds office. So I was familiar with land title work. And after the war, I came back and I had 3 months terminal leave. I didn't have to work. I didn't have to do a doggone thing for the first time in my life ever. But I was going to take it easy. Well, the owner of the office came up and asked me if I wouldn't come down and manage the office. And I said, no, I'm just resting and I'm enjoying it. And I like it. He said, well, everything is such a mess down there. During the war, we couldn't get trained help. We've got backlogs of orders several months back that we haven't even gotten to yet. We'd like you to come down and manage the office. He gave me a backhanded compliment. He said, you were a captain. You must have some executive ability. I said, I think I have. He said, well, I'd like you to come back and manage the office. And I said, well, I don't know about it. It would be nice to earn a little extra money and manage the office, yes, but I've got a contract here to teach come September. It's the job I wanted to teach. I was to teach history, that was my major. I was to teach history in the high school here in Allegan, which is a job I wanted. And it would lead to other things, you know, along the way. But for a beginning, that was what I really wanted to do, my field. And he said, well, I understand, but September's still several months from now. You might be able to get the thing organized by then, at least, get it straightened out. So I said, okay, but understand, come September, I'm going to leave. And so came September, and actually, by that time, my nerves were in a jangle. I didn't want to be in an enclosed classroom with kids. Order had pretty nearly disappeared in school by that time. It was a different world altogether. So I got to thinking about this. And he said, well, I won't hold it against you if you leave. Maybe you can come down summers like you've been doing. But he said, I'd like you to be here all the time. I'll give you an option to buy the office when I get ready to sell it if you want to. And I'll give you a percentage of the profits in the meantime, as well as a salary. And I will understand if you want to leave. I understand. I won't hold it against you. I won't begrudge your opportunity. But I'd like you here. So I said, okay, I'll go down and give it a try. Well, I was in the title business 67 years. I was the oldest land title man still working when I was retired by a computer in 2005.
Wow.
And I won't have a computer in the house.
All right. Although I should point out to you that this interview will eventually be accessible over a computer. So
They still have to call me up
yep.
because there are things that didn't get put in the computer of the records. They couldn't. No, this is funny. A while ago, people were planning this new jail, and they were discussing whether the county actually had a title to that block. And so they went to the Register of Deeds office, which I knew inside and out from 67 years of service there, and some besides. At least once a day going up there to check records. And so one of the girls in the office called and said, Mr. Pahl, is there a deed to the courthouse? Is there a recorded deed? I said, yes, there's a recorded deed. She said, would you please tell me where to find it? I said, won't your computer find it? No. I said, look in Liber 6. There are two of them side by side. One is where the land company that platted this whole town deeded it to the village, and the village deeded it to the county for a courthouse site. So I got a good laugh.
You were one up on the computer.
Doggone computer.
All right. Well, that makes for a pretty good story. Now, if you look back on the time that you spent in the military, what kind of effect do you think that experience had on you? What did you take out of it or learn from it?
Well, I still, this little clock at my desk here still records the clock in military time. It was a present. But there are certain things that I do. Now, the only time I ever struck my wife in the 28 years we were married and before she passed away was one time. But there's a certain clap of thunder. When it goes off, it sounds like a 109 exactly. Well, we were sleeping one night and the thunder was right overhead and sleeping very nicely. And bang! That thunderclap, I was sat right up in bed. I was wide awake and I said, who is shooting or who's shelling us? What's going on? My wife sat up and said, what did you say? And I hit her with the back of my hand. I said, get down, we're being shelled. So there are certain things that remind you of time in service. There was a certain alarm signal on our fire station we had for a while that was the same as our air raid warning siren in India. Probably the same kind of a machine, but that every time they'd blow that signal downtown, I'd start counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, fire the gun. Every 6 seconds, they fired the minute gun to warn the civilian population. And so I'd be counting the minute gun to see if they were on the ball.
Right. Now, you mentioned hearing the sounds of artillery shells. Where were you when you would have heard that?
Was I what?
Well, you mentioned hearing the sound of artillery shells. Where had you heard those?
Yes, we could hear them. Heavens, yes. I used to like to go over and work out on, if I had time off, I would go over and work out a little with the ACAC. And so, yes, I'd hear the guns. Yeah, that was another one of my jobs when I was in India. This was British theater, remember? And we had the Highland unit backing us up. And we had to have a liaison office between our American headquarters at the British headquarters. So the captain calls, or our colonel calls me in, and General Davidson, and he later became the commander at Selfridge when we were recalled. Fine to meet him again. But anyway, he appointed me to be the American liaison officer between our headquarters and theirs. And they appointed Captain Jock Duncan from Aberdeen as their liaison officer to our headquarters. Well, Jock and I got to be bosom buddies. We had quite a lot of things to work out between us at various times. We got an awful lot of good jokes and things going. And anyway, good old Jock, well, I'd go down there because down there they were manning the ACAC. And so I'd go out and work with Jock and listen to the different guns. And I got so I could identify the caliber by the noise it made. There's a funny story Jock told me. I was standing there talking to him one day, and this is nothing you want to repeat, I'm sure. But anyway, they had just gotten some replacements in their unit, and these fellows had been like we had been to a school to learn how to do things. I think it was Sandhurst in England. But anyway, here's this artillery officer out there directing this bunch of guys that have been out there in India fighting for 3 years how to build a gun emplacement. And he's busy telling them, you know. And he came running up to Jock Duncan and he said, "Captain, I want you to court-martial that gun crew." And Jock said, "What? That's a pretty serious charge. Court-martial? I don't want to think about it." "Did they do something?" "Yes, they did. They certainly did." And I said, "Well, what did they do? Tell me what they did before I decide what I must do." And he said, "Well, I was telling them how to build this gun emplacement, and their sergeant stood up and told me to go to hell." And he said that was derogatory of my rank. And Jock looked at the lieutenant a minute and he said, "Now, Lieutenant, don't get excited. Calm down. You don't have to go." So I had fun. I tried to learn as much as I could. I knew I could never afford to go to all these different places I went in service and do a lot of things I'd never be able to afford to do or be asked to do again. So I tried to learn just as much as I could. And I learned a lot of things.
Mm-hmm. And your recall of it is very good, and you've done a very good job here today laying out your story. So I just want to close the interview here by thanking you for taking the time to do it. All right.
Well, I hope it was usable.